"I will be yours forever if you protect my children," the widow whispered, her eyes searching his, carrying a desperation that could break a man's heart. The sun was a cruel overseer, beating down on the cracked earth of the valley, turning the dry dust into a haze that blurred the horizon. Mara's small children clung to her skirts, their faces streaked with soot and tears, eyes wide with the silent fear of hunger and loss. She had walked for miles through the remains of a village that no longer existed. The charred timbers of her home, reduced to blackened splinters, scattered across the ground, like forgotten memories. Every step she took reminded her of what she had lost: her husband, her neighbors, her sense of safety. And yet she kept walking, because beyond this wasteland there was one man who could give her what she needed: protection. She saw him before he saw her. Cale, the Apache warrior, stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He was alone as always, a figure as much a part of the wilderness as the gnarled juniper trees around him. Mara's heart tightened. She had heard the whispers about him, the way he moved through danger as if it belonged to him, the way no one could match his skill with a bow or a knife. He was a man who belonged to no one, and yet she had no choice but to hope that he could be the shield her children needed. Her voice trembled when she called out to him, the sound almost swallowed by the wind. Cale turned slowly, his dark eyes assessing her with the careful scrutiny of a predator who had learned to survive by trusting no one. Mara took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of fear and urgency within her. "Please," she said, her voice firmer now. "I beg you to help us." Cale's gaze shifted to the children, and for the first time there was a flicker of something: curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of compassion. Mara stepped closer, feeling the weight of her vulnerability press down on her chest. She knew that words alone would not persuade him. She needed to offer him something more, something powerful enough to make a man like Cale consider abandoning his solitary life. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered, kneeling to meet his eyes. Her fingers brushed against the rough leather of her satchel, inside of which lay the few meager belongings she had been able to save. No gold, no land. Nothing but these children. Her gaze shifted to the two small figures behind her, clutching at her skirts as if they were anchors to a world that had vanished. "To us and myself. I will be yours forever if you protect them." The words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. Cale's expression remained unreadable, though the wind seemed to catch the edges of his hesitation. He was a man who had been betrayed too many times, who had watched loved ones fall and disappear into the dust of memory. Yet here was a woman who offered herself, not as a plea, not as a bribe, but as a solemn vow, and with it, the fragile lives of her children. Mara dared to hope as she extended her hands, open and unguarded, showing him that she trusted him completely. Her heart pounded, not only with fear, but with a strange flicker of courage she did not know she possessed. She had seen the worst the world had to offer, and yet she still believed that someone could stand between her children and the darkness. That someone was him. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered her. He could smell the dust, the sweat, the fear, but also the determination. She was not asking out of convenience. She was asking out of necessity. And for the first time in many years, Cale felt the weight of a choice that mattered. Not survival, not revenge, but something entirely different: responsibility. Mara held her breath, feeling the seconds stretch into a tense eternity. The valley around them was silent, save for the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. She did not flinch as Cale finally stepped down from the ridge, his boots crunching against the earth. For a moment their eyes locked, and in that gaze a fragile understanding passed between them. She had laid her heart bare, and he had noticed. "I will consider it," Cale said at last, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of someone who spoke rarely and with purpose. Mara's chest tightened with a cautious hope. It was not a promise, but it was enough. A beginning. And sometimes the beginning was all that was needed to survive. Cale's steps were measured as he led the small group away from the ridge, but his mind was far from calm. He had walked alone for years, the vast wilderness his only companion, and he had long since learned that attachment was a dangerous luxury. People brought pain, people brought distraction, and yet here was Mara, her plea still ringing in his ears, her children clinging to her skirts like fragile threads of hope. He glanced at them from the corner of his eye. The boy, no more than 7, had dirt-smudged cheeks and eyes too old for his years. The girl, smaller and more fragile, held tightly to her mother's hand, her grip white-knuckled with fear. Kyle felt a pang, sharp and unfamiliar, but he quickly buried it. He could not afford sentiment, not with the world as unforgiving as it was. Mara, sensing his hesitation, tried to break the silence. "I know you've lost much," she said softly, "but perhaps you can save them from the same fate." Her voice carried no accusation, only quiet understanding. Cale's jaw tightened. He had indeed lost much: family, friends, trust. He had wandered the lands like a ghost, feared and respected, never wanted, never needed. He had survived battles, ambushes, and betrayals, but the vulnerability of children and of a woman who relied on him was a new kind of danger. They walked in silence for hours, the sun creeping lower in the sky, painting the desert in a palette of burning orange and deepening shadow. Cale's mind raced with the practicalities of survival: food, water, shelter. Mara had little to offer, and he doubted her ability to survive in the wild for long without guidance. Still, she was determined. She asked questions, absorbed every piece of instruction he offered about identifying edible plants, finding fresh water, and evading danger. Her willingness to learn impressed him, but it also reminded him of the fragility he was tasked to protect. As dusk approached, Cale finally spoke. "I do not promise loyalty, nor do I promise love. I only promise that as long as I am able, I will keep you and your children alive." His voice was steady, devoid of warmth, but there was an undercurrent of resolve. Mara's relief was palpable. It was not the vow she had hoped for, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were precious in a world as cruel as theirs. Mara nodded, her grip on her children tightening. "That is enough," she whispered, though inside her heart soared. She could feel the beginnings of a bond forming, tentative but undeniable. Cale may have refused to give his heart, but he had given them something almost as valuable: his strength, his skill, and his presence. Night fell quickly over the valley. Cale led them to a hidden alcove beneath a rocky overhang, a natural shelter he had used in the past. He started a small fire, careful to keep it low and hidden, and watched as Mara and the children settled nearby. The flames illuminated their faces, revealing worry etched into her features and fear mirrored in the children's eyes. For the first time, Cale felt the weight of responsibility in a tangible way. He spent the night keeping watch, listening to the subtle sounds of the desert, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant howl of a coyote, the whispering wind through the rocks. Mara slept fitfully beside her children, and he allowed himself a brief glance at their peaceful faces. Something stirred within him, an unfamiliar sense of purpose that had nothing to do with survival or vengeance. Morning came, harsh and bright, and Cale's resolve hardened. He still did not fully trust attachment, still doubted the wisdom of his choice, but he knew one thing: the world was unforgiving, and Mara and her children were vulnerable. If he could not protect them, no one would, and so the reluctant warrior walked on, carrying the weight of a promise he had not fully made to his heart, but had made with his actions. Every step forward was a quiet rebellion against his solitary nature. Every glance at the children, a reminder that even the hardest of hearts could not remain untouched forever. The morning air was sharp with the scent of sage and dust, and the sun had not yet climbed high enough to burn away the chill that lingered over the valley. Kyle led Mara and the children down a narrow, winding path that hugged the side of the ridge. Every step was deliberate, calculated, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the bough slung across his back. The desert was quiet, deceptively so, and Cale knew from experience that silence often preceded danger. Mara struggled to keep pace. The children's small legs were quick, but they tired easily, their pace uneven. She adjusted the satchel over her shoulder, feeling the weight of meager supplies, dried meat, a small water skin, a few bundles of herbs, and cursed herself silently for having so little to offer. Yet each time she looked at Cale, she drew courage. He moved like a shadow, sure-footed and watchful, his presence a shield against the invisible threats of the wild. "Kyle," she said cautiously, breaking the silence that had settled between them like dust. "How far until we find water?" Kyle did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on a distant ridge, where a line of jagged rocks broke the horizon. "A day's walk," he said finally, his voice low. "If we're careful. And if the water hasn't dried up." Mara's stomach tightened. One day's walk without reliable water was a gamble, especially for the children. She glanced at the boy who had begun to fidget, his small face pale, and the girl who clutched her hand nervously. She swallowed her fear. "We'll make it," she said, more to convince herself than them. Cale gave no response, but he did not contradict her. The terrain grew harsher as they descended into a narrow canyon, where shadows pooled and the heat of the sun became more intense with every step. Cale moved ahead, occasionally gesturing for them to slow, to hide, or to listen. He taught them how to identify signs of danger. The broken twig that betrayed a predator's path, the faint rustle of wind over sand that could mask an approaching human. Mara absorbed everything he said, repeating the instructions to the children like a mantra, hoping the knowledge would be enough to protect them. By midday, the first real challenge arrived. A band of scavengers, faces painted with streaks of soot and aggression in their eyes, emerged from a ridge above. Mara froze, the children clinging to her skirts. Cale's hand dropped to his bow, his movements fluid and controlled, almost instinctive. He stepped in front of Mara, positioning himself between them and the threat. The scavengers shouted, brandishing crude weapons, demanding whatever supplies the small group carried. Mara's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay still, her eyes meeting Cale's briefly. There was a silent promise in that glance. "I will not let them touch you." Cale's voice rang out, calm but commanding. "Back away now." His arrow knocked almost as a whisper, a warning. The leader of the scavengers stepped forward, smirking, underestimating the lone Apache warrior. Cale's stance shifted, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Every muscle coiled like a spring. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Mara it felt like an eternity. Then a single arrow whistled through the air, embedding itself in the ground just in front of the leader's feet. The scavengers hesitated, eyes wide with sudden fear. Cale didn't flinch, didn't lower his bow. "Leave or face me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a storm. Slowly the scavengers retreated, disappearing into the canyon as suddenly as they had appeared. Mara exhaled, trembling, and pulled her children close. Cale glanced at them briefly, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said simply. No congratulations, no praise, just the quiet command that had saved them. Mara realized then that protection was not about comfort or kindness. It was about survival, vigilance, and the willingness to act when the moment demanded it. As evening fell, they finally reached a small oasis, a hidden pool of water surrounded by scrub and stones. The children ran ahead, laughter breaking the tension of the day while Mara sank to her knees, cupping water to her lips and tears to her eyes. Cale watched silently, his eyes scanning the horizon once more, never letting his guard down. That night, around a small fire, Mara realized that the journey had begun, not just in miles, but in trust. Cale's presence was both shield and lesson. He taught them that survival required courage, discipline, and sometimes cold calculation. And while he remained distant, unyielding in spirit, Mara could not help but feel the first threads of connection forming, a fragile bond born of necessity and danger, one that might yet become stronger in the days to come. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next as Cale, Mara, and the children navigated the harsh, unrelenting wilderness. The initial tension between Mara and Cale slowly began to shift, not into familiarity, not yet, but into a fragile rhythm of reliance. Every morning Cale rose before dawn, scanning the horizon, listening for danger in the whisper of the wind or the distant cry of predators. Mara awoke beside him, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and found herself studying the man she had once seen only as a warrior, now beginning to see him as a protector, almost a constant presence in a world that had been so mercilessly chaotic. The children, though still wary, started to trust him in ways they could not articulate. The boy, who had spent the last months in a state of anxious vigilance, would now mimic Cale's careful movements, watching footprints in the sand, examining the sky for signs of approaching weather, and learning which plants were safe to eat. The girl, timid at first, began to whisper her small observations to Mara, glancing occasionally at Cale to see if he approved. Cale rarely spoke directly to them, but when he did, it was always with clarity and authority, and they learned quickly that following his guidance often meant safety. One afternoon, as they traversed a narrow canyon lined with jagged rocks, Mara stumbled on uneven ground. Cale's hand shot out, steadying her before she fell. The contact was brief, yet Mara felt a warmth that startled her. "Careful," he said, his voice low. A hint of exasperation mingled with something softer, something almost like concern. Mara nodded, cheeks flushing, and murmured, "Thank you." Kyle didn't reply, but his eyes lingered on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. As they walked, Mara began to share stories of the past, the village she had lost, the life she had once imagined for her children, and the husband who had fallen defending their home. She spoke quietly, not to ask for sympathy, but to unburden herself. Kyle listened, the rigid lines of his face softening imperceptibly. He said little, but each nod, each attentive glance told Mara that her words were not falling on empty ground. One evening, a storm rolled in, sudden and violent. Winds tore through the canyon, and rain pelted them with merciless force. Kyle immediately took charge, directing Mara to shelter the children beneath a rocky overhang, while he worked to secure their scant supplies. Mara watched in awe as he moved with precise efficiency, his body a conduit of skill, honed over countless trials. For the first time she realized the depth of his competence and the cost of that life lived alone. That night, as the storm raged outside, the four huddled together under the rocky shelter. The children shivered, and Mara held them close, feeling the weight of exhaustion and gratitude. Cale remained slightly apart, his posture rigid, but he did not retreat from their presence. For the first time, Mara allowed herself to notice the faint softness in his eyes as he watched her tend to the children, a subtle acknowledgement that he cared not in words, but in action. The days that followed were filled with small lessons and shared hardships. Cale taught them how to move silently, how to find water, and how to read the sky for signs of danger. Mara, in turn, shared warmth, comfort, and reassurance, slowly bridging the gap between survival and something resembling family. The children laughed more freely, their fear of the world lessening as Kyle's presence became a constant shield. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant ridges, Mara watched Kyle sit alone by the fire, sharpening his knives with meticulous care. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him. "I think we are starting to make it," she said softly, gesturing to the children playing nearby. Kyle's eyes lifted briefly, meeting hers. There was no smile, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond forming among them. For the first time, Mara felt hope, not just for survival, but for a future where they might all endure together. She realized that Kyle, the man who had once seemed untouchable and aloof, was beginning to care, not for the sake of obligation, but because he chose to. And in that quiet understanding, a seed of trust had taken root, fragile yet unyielding, growing stronger with each shared challenge, each life-saving lesson, and each silent acknowledgement of the bond forming between warrior and family. The desert's heat had finally relented, replaced by the dry chill of early evening. Cale led Mara and the children through a narrow ravine, the shadows stretching long across the sand. For days they had traveled cautiously, avoiding main trails, staying close to cover and moving only when necessary. The trust between them had grown, fragile yet steady. But Kyle knew that trust would soon be tested. He had been tracking them for hours, following their trail like a predator. Kyle's sharp instincts warned him of movement, faint footprints overlaid on the sand, the whisper of wind carrying the scent of unfamiliar bodies. Mara noticed his sudden stillness and tense posture. "What is it?" she asked, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Trouble," Kyle said simply, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We are not alone." Mara's pulse quickened. She glanced at the children, who clung to her skirts and tried to mask her fear with a calm she did not feel. Who is it?" Cale shook his head. "A gang of raiders. They've been following us. Likely after the children, the supplies, or both. They won't hesitate to kill to get what they want." His voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of certainty that came from years of survival. For the first time, Mara felt the full weight of their vulnerability. The desert had been a threat in its own right, but these were human predators, calculated, cruel, and relentless. She tightened her grip on the children and searched Cale's face for reassurance. He met her gaze, his dark eyes calm yet piercing, and she realized that fear alone would not save them. Only strategy, courage, and trust in him could. Cale quickly assessed the terrain. The ravine narrowed ahead, and jagged rocks provided natural cover. He directed Mara to lead the children along a path less visible, while he scouted ahead, moving silently over the stones, listening for every sound. Mara followed his instructions without hesitation, the rhythm of his commands now ingrained in her mind. The children mirrored her movements, stepping lightly, their eyes wide but alert. Hours passed with tense anticipation. Every rustle, every shifting shadow made Mara's heart leap, but Cale remained a steady presence, guiding them, protecting them. At dusk, the raiders finally appeared. A group of men armed with crude weapons, their laughter harsh and unrestrained, echoing off the canyon walls. Mara froze, the children pressing close to her, their eyes reflecting terror. Cale stepped forward, placing himself between the raiders and the family. His posture was calm but lethal, every muscle coiled for action. The leader of the gang stepped closer, underestimating Cale as they often did, assuming a lone warrior would be easily intimidated. Kyle's eyes, sharp and unwavering, met the man's gaze. "Leave now," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a storm ready to break. The raiders laughed, but Cale did not move, did not flinch. He nocked an arrow and drew the bowstring with precision. A single shot flew, embedding itself into the ground at the leader's feet. Silence fell for a heartbeat before chaos erupted. Cale moved with deadly efficiency, every motion calculated, blocking attacks, striking weak points, and ensuring Mara and the children remained out of harm's way. The fight was brutal, but swift. The raiders underestimated Cale's skill and the terrain's advantage. By the time the dust settled, several were wounded or retreating, and the rest had fled into the canyon's shadows. Mara's knees buckled, relief flooding her as she embraced her children. Cale, though covered in dirt and sweat, remained composed, scanning the horizon for any further threats. That night, as they settled in a small alcove for shelter, Mara looked at Cale with new understanding. He had not only protected them, but had proven that their survival depended entirely on his strength and skill. For the first time, she realized the depth of the promise she had made, and how much she now depended on him. Cale, sitting slightly apart by the fire, observed her silently. There was no outward display of emotion, yet the way he watched over them spoke volumes. The danger had reminded them all of the fragility of life in the wilderness, but it also solidified their bond, a bond of trust, reliance, and mutual recognition of the stakes they faced. Mara's heart ached with gratitude, and something deeper, something she dared not name. She realized that Cale's protection had become more than a shield. It was the foundation of their fragile hope. And she knew with certainty that the next trials would test not just their survival, but the strength of the trust and loyalty growing among them. The desert dawn was pale and brittle, the kind of morning that promised both clarity and peril. Cale had sensed it before anyone else, a shift in the wind, the faintest crunch of disturbed sand, the whispers of movement far off in the canyon. The raiders were returning, larger in number than before, and this time they came with a single purpose, to take what they believed was theirs. Cale's jaw tightened. He had protected Mara and the children so far, but this would be the true test of his promise. Every instinct honed over years of survival, the silent observation, the patient calculation, the precise strike, told him that there would be no room for error. He quickly assessed the terrain. Jagged rocks provided cover, narrow passes could funnel the attackers, and a hidden ravine could serve as both trap and shield. He gathered Mara and the children behind a natural barricade of boulders. "Stay low," he instructed, his voice calm but commanding. "Do exactly as I say. Trust me, and we will survive this." Mara's grip on the children tightened, her heart pounding, but she nodded. She had come to know that Cale's words were not empty. They were a lifeline. The raiders appeared at the edge of the ravine, their laughter cruel and overconfident. Cale stepped into view, his stance steady, every movement deliberate. He let the first wave approach, drawing them into the narrow canyon where their numbers counted for less. With a swift motion, he loosed his arrows, each one finding its mark with unerring precision. The raiders faltered, confusion and fear flashing across their faces. The fight escalated. Cale moved like a shadow, striking with lethal efficiency, blocking attacks and using the terrain to his advantage. Rocks became barricades, narrow ledges a trap, and Cale's knowledge of every foot of the canyon allowed him to anticipate every move. Mara watched in awe and terror as he fought, not recklessly, but with a controlled ferocity that left no doubt about his skill. The children crouched behind her, eyes wide, whispering prayers they barely understood. Mara's mind raced. She had promised to protect them, yet she could do nothing against such a storm. All she could do was trust Cale and hope that his promise would hold. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Cale's movements were a blur, his focus absolute. Several raiders fell, others fled, and one, desperate and dangerous, lunged toward the children. Without hesitation, Cale intercepted, using the full force of his strength and skill to neutralize the threat. A tense silence followed, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant echo of retreating footsteps. When the dust finally settled, Cale stood among the rocks, exhausted but unbroken. Mara rushed forward, gathering the children into her arms, tears streaming down her face. "You saved them." "You saved us," she whispered, her voice choked with relief. Cale did not respond immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon to ensure the danger had truly passed. Then slowly he allowed himself a small nod, a rare acknowledgement that the battle was over and they were safe, for now. That night, around a small, controlled fire, Mara watched Cale from across the flames. The man who had seemed so impenetrable, so distant, now bore the unmistakable marks of battle, exhaustion, vigilance, and the quiet weight of responsibility. Yet he remained steadfast, a protector who had honored his promise when it mattered most. Mara approached him, her voice soft. "Cale, I know I asked for your protection, but today you gave more than I ever could have imagined. You risked everything for us." Cale's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, yet something softened in that gaze, a recognition that their bond had deepened beyond necessity. "I promised," he said simply, his voice low but unwavering. "I keep my promises." For Mara, the words carried a weight far greater than any battle could. The ultimate test had been survived, and through it the fragile trust, reliance, and unspoken connection between them had been forged stronger than ever. She knew now that Cale's protection was not just a shield. It was a commitment born of skill, courage, and something deeper, something that might, in time, grow into a bond neither could deny. The morning after the battle was quiet, almost surreal. The desert was calm, the sun rising over jagged ridges to cast long golden shadows across the sand. The echoes of the raiders' retreat had faded, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind through the rocks. Mara sat with the children, brushing sand from their hair, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from relief. They were alive. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, shaky breath. Cale emerged from the shadows, his movements deliberate, every muscle taut from exhaustion. He had fought fiercely, yet he bore no visible wounds, only the weariness etched into his eyes. Mara studied him quietly, seeing him not just as a warrior, but as a protector who had risked everything for her family. A strange warmth stirred in her chest, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something more tender. Something she had not dared to name until now. The children played nearby, their laughter cautious but genuine, a fragile echo of innocence returning. Mara glanced at Cale, noticing the subtle ways he watched them, the protective tilt of his head, the careful positioning of his body between them and any potential danger, the quiet vigilance that never fully rested. It was in these moments, in his silent dedication, that she felt the first threads of something beyond mere gratitude. She realized that she had come to depend on him, not only for safety, but for strength, guidance, and even comfort. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and painted the desert in shades of fire and gold, Mara found herself beside Cale at the edge of the firelight. He had cleaned their meager supplies, sharpened his knives, and yet there was a rare pause in his usual vigilance, a fleeting softness in his dark eyes. Mara gathered courage and spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "You fought for them, for us, not because you had to, but because you chose to." She paused, searching his face. I think I've always known I needed you, but now I know I couldn't survive without you." Kyle's gaze met hers, steady, intense, and unreadable for a heartbeat. Then slowly the edge of his sternness softened. "I did what I promised," he said, his voice low but firm. "It was not easy. It never is, but I will do it again." His words were simple, yet in them lay an unspoken truth. The promise had become more than duty. It had become personal. Mara felt her chest tighten, a mixture of relief and something deeper. She reached out, her hand brushing against his, tentative, searching. Kyle did not pull away. Instead, he allowed the contact, subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging that the bond they had forged in fire and danger could grow into something stronger, something lasting. The children approached cautiously, sensing the shift in the quiet tension between the two adults. Mara smiled softly at them, then turned her attention back to Kyle. "We've survived so much together," she said. "And yet, I feel like we're just beginning." Kale's expression remained guarded, but there was a flicker of something unspoken, acceptance, perhaps even hope. He had lived for years in solitude, his heart shuttered against the world. Yet Mara and her children had pierced that armor, not with words or promises, but through trust, reliance, and shared struggle. As night deepened, they huddled together by the fire. Mara held her children close, Kyle beside them, an unspoken shield against the vast, indifferent desert. In that quiet intimacy, forged through danger and survival, Mara understood the truth she had long feared to admit. Love could grow from necessity, from shared hardship, and from the courage to trust someone completely. And in Kale's steady presence, Mara felt it, a bond unbreakable, born of fire, danger, and unwavering commitment. The promise she had once made in desperation had blossomed into something richer, deeper, and far more enduring than she could have imagined. Love, she realized, was not just survival. It was choosing each other again and again, even in a world that offered no guarantees. The days that followed were quieter, yet filled with a new rhythm. The desert, once a place of threat and uncertainty, began to feel less like a prison and more like a home, rugged, challenging, but alive with possibility. Kale, Mara, and the children moved cautiously through hidden valleys and shaded canyons, ever vigilant, but no longer haunted by the immediate terror of raiders on their heels. The bond between them, forged in danger and tested in fire, had matured into something steady and undeniable. Mara watched the children as they ran along a narrow creek, their laughter ringing out against the rocky cliffs. For the first time in months, their small voices carried not fear but joy. The boy clambered up a jagged boulder, daring himself to leap to the next rock, and the girl trailed behind, giggling as Mara called encouragement. Kyle observed from a short distance, his posture relaxed yet ready, a silent guardian whose presence had become second nature to them all. Mara approached him, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "They're thriving," she said softly, "because of you." Kyle's eyes met hers, dark and steady. "Because we trusted each other," he corrected, his voice low. "They listened. You listened. I did my part." "So did you." For Mara, the simplicity of his words carried more weight than any declaration of love. It was acknowledgement, respect, and partnership, the foundation of a family built not by circumstance alone, but by choice. She realized that in a world that had stripped everything from her, they had carved out something rare and precious: safety, trust, and belonging. As the sun dipped low, painting the desert sky in shades of amber and rose, Kyle led them to a hidden valley, a place he had known in his travels, shielded by cliffs and thick brush. A natural spring bubbled nearby, and the soil was fertile enough to promise growth and sustenance. It was remote, defensible, and perfect. Here, Mara realized, they could finally build a life. Over the following weeks, they worked together to make the valley their own. Mara tended small gardens, teaching the children to cultivate food, while Kyle hunted and scouted, ensuring that the hidden sanctuary remained secure. Slowly, they built shelters from stone and wood, crafted tools, and collected water. Each day was hard work, but each day was theirs, and in the labor, their bond deepened. At night, they gathered by the fire, the children between them, listening to Kale's quiet stories of the land, of survival, and of the wisdom he had gained in years of wandering. Mara's hand would brush his occasionally, lingering in comfort and intimacy, and Kale no longer pulled away. Their shared glances, subtle gestures, and quiet understanding spoke of a love that had grown naturally from shared struggle and unwavering commitment. One evening, as stars blanketed the sky, Mara whispered to Kyle, "I never thought I'd find a home, a family, after all we've lost." Kyle looked at her, the flicker of firelight reflecting in his eyes. "We've built one," he said simply, "together." And in that moment, surrounded by the children's soft breathing and the desert's vast silent beauty, Mara felt a peace she had never known. They were not just survivors. They were a family, forged in fire and fear, and tempered by trust and love. The valley became their sanctuary, a place where laughter replaced tears, courage replaced fear, and love replaced desperation. Kyle, once a solitary warrior, now walked beside Mara and the children, not as a protector alone, but as a father, a partner, and the heart of a family he had once thought impossible. For Mara, Kyle, and the children, the promise that had begun with desperation, "I will be yours forever if you protect my children," had become a reality far richer than she could have imagined. They had survived, yes, but more importantly, they had chosen each other. And in the vast, unforgiving desert, they had found home,